Hello, I'm Josephine Burton and welcome back to the Dash Arts podcast, seeing the world through an artistic lens. A good friend of mine, Mark Rosenblatt, a theatre maker based in London, recently made a short film, Ganef. Ganef is a domestic drama set in the 1960s that tells the story of a little girl spooked by a dark tale from her mother's experiences in Nazi Germany, who starts to believe her adored cleaner is a thief. It's an exquisitely observed film, focusing on some minute details that speak volumes. Over lockdowns this year, Mark and I have gone for periodic socially distant walks with his toddler. His film, and the wider conversations we've had on the complicated impact of trauma on the next generation, inspired this podcast. It led to a series of fantastic conversations with artists, academics and psychologists on the nature of trauma and the role that art can play in healing it. But first, here's Mark explaining what inspired his film.
I'd always been very aware, or growing up, of people who weren't around in the family. My family survived, my mum's side survived Nazi Germany. My grandmother was born in Frankfurt, as was my grandfather. And my grandmother spent the war on the run and in hiding, and lost many of her immediate family survived, but many of her kind of wider family were murdered. And so growing up, I was just very aware that, you know, we looked at family photographs and there was cousins that should have been around but weren't, and people that there were just lots of scars and sort of unspoken tragedies in this very sort of perfectly nice life that everyone was living in London. And I guess sort of there was baggage, there were sadnesses and unspoken losses. And I remember, for instance, my auntie Itza. I remember one time as a kid watching her pouring some tea at my parents' house whilst we were having some kind of tea party, and she rolled up her sleeves and there was her Auschwitz tattoo. And so this sort of strange disconnect between nice London, middle-class London life and this sudden sort of vista opening up of sort of trauma and, you know, an unthinkable. And I knew subsequently, I found out that Itza had been in Auschwitz, and that in fact, we found a big photograph that was discovered of Mengele walking through Auschwitz doing one of his selections, and someone had found Itza as a child in the crowd, avoiding selection. So these kinds of almost like cognitive dissonance, these just like, whoa, we're having a tea party, and this woman was there. I was just very aware of it growing up. My mum told me this story about my grandmother who had, you know, in many ways had a lovely life, but, you know, and she was a very jolly, wonderful person, but she also carried a sadness in her and a depressive streak, I think, and a loss of confidence, because she had been a teenager in the war, and a child, and then like 14, maybe 15 at the end of the war. She lost her entire education. She'd never been educated, I mean, as just one casualty for her of the experience of the Holocaust. So she never really had the confidence or the trust of the world around her, that people had taken that from her. And so she's just, on a very, very simple level, my mum told me the story. When she was little, she remembered that my grandmother used to instinctively, when she bought something nice, would like try and hide the shopping from the cleaner. And when my mum asked her why, she said, if they don't know what you've got, they can't take it from you. And this isn't to say that my grandmother was sort of, you know, paranoid about everything and didn't trust anyone, but there was a sort of just a deep irrational trust. I mean, she lived in a nice house, like she didn't need to hide, you know, hiding the nice shopping wasn't going to kind of persuade a cleaner that there was nothing to take if they were so inclined, which they weren't. But so she used to sort of cross the roads to avoid policemen in uniform. Always, she never trusted even taking a taxi anywhere. And I just thought it was an interesting starting point for a short film, which has to be so compressed as a bit of storytelling. Like, what would happen if the little girl kind of swallowed that story so much that she acted on it, that she went from being that she became very mistrustful herself of the cleaner, and what would happen if she loved the cleaner. And that's really what my film's about. It's about a little girl who loves her cleaner in 1960s London, a little Jewish girl, and how a moment like that, a mother, a survivor, telling her daughter to hide the shopping, transforms the friendship into something that is very mistrustful and destructive.
Why can't people see the bags?
You know, when I was little, in Frankfurt,
Yes.
and the people who hurt us,
Yes.
well, one soldier, a gunner, a thief, came to our home and he took what we had. But if he didn't know what we had, he couldn't take it.
Is the gunner coming here?
No. Please, Schäffler, go play. Not now. Mummy's tired, okay? Please.
That was a tiny clip from Ganef. We'll put a link to the trailer in our show notes. I was extremely moved by Mark's beautiful film and the family stories, silences and memories that had inspired him. Our conversation led me to reach out to a few other friends and colleagues who were also making work that explores or is in dialogue in some way with the legacy of trauma in their families. I wanted to hear about their work and what inspired them. I spoke to Silvina de Megatician, a Berlin-based artist from Argentina whose family is originally Armenian. Silvina's grandparents fled the Ottoman Empire in 1917, escaping the Armenian genocide. Her work is cross-disciplinary, stunning, and rooted in her complex identity and family history.
My grandparents, they were refugees. The first term, most of the Armenian refugees from the Ottoman Empire ended up in Syria and Lebanon. You had the refugee camps, and a lot of them also find refuge in France and others in the US. But my family is spread over the world. But my grandparents, first they were in the orphanage in Syria and Lebanon, and then part of them were also in Paris, and then they went to Argentina. I grew up with my grandmother. She was in the desert, and she survived from my father's side, Agavni. She talked a little bit, but in general, I mean, it was clear genocide happened, a lot of suffering happened, but they would not go into details. And my grandmother, yes, I mean, sometimes I would sleep in her room with my sister, and she would cry, or we have the image of her father that he got cut off the head. So it was a kind of very strange for me, you know, as Argentinian little girl, to see this man with this hat. It was the face, you know, and we heard like some things from her. I mean, there I was in this environment where it was clear we were the victims of a genocide. I was in this Armenian school, and in history we would learn what the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish did to us and what we lost. It was a theme that was present. When I came to Germany, it's a moment where I got a kind of distance, and I began to put questions. And then, but my grandmother, she was already very, very old, and she couldn't answer those questions. So I got a lot of answers from the documents. I got it was 20 years ago, I think, or something like that. I got the documents of them. My uncle, he was putting everything out because my grandma was in a house, for elderly people, and all the belongings of my grandma. And then he came with this old suitcase, and told me, I think you are interested in the past. If you like, you can have this suitcase. So I opened the suitcase and I found a lot of photographs and documents, refugee documents from my grandparents. And out of those, let's say, facts written on paper, then I began to recreate the whole story and put more questions and so on and so on. Yeah. It's a case of third generation, the grandchildren, they have another, as I was saying, another distance, and they can ask those questions. The first generation, they were busy with survival and trying to set up food in Argentina. And my parents, second generation, they were also trying to integrate. And I mean, it's sometimes the work of the grandchildren. So when I came with all those questions, they were very open.
I also spoke to Chigozie Obioma. Chigozie is a twice Booker Prize nominated author, originally from Nigeria and now based in the US. Chigozie is currently writing a novel about the Biafran War, a civil war in Nigeria fought from 1967 to 1970 between the government and the secessionist state of Biafra. He explained what had inspired his novel.
It's so my grandfather from my dad's side fought in the war, even though he was a bit past his youth. He was almost 50. So my dad says that he died of prostrate problems exacerbated by the war, but he wasn't necessarily wounded, but nobody knows. But anyway, the fact is that he died during the war at the very middle of it in 1968. So not knowing him, not getting to meet him, is something that I often think about a lot. People don't like to talk about it. Generally, I mean, people have been starting to write something like a few years ago, there was a novel that was written about the wartime situation. So I make a distinction between wartime novels and war novels. Wartime novels, just they are obviously impactful, but they are concerned more about the situation of the civilians caught in the throes of the violence. But what war novels actually are, you're with the fighters in the trenches, and you're witnessing the brutalities and all that. So that's what I'm writing. I feel like that hasn't been written really. So one of my motivations is to actually reenact and create a kind of a document, fictional form of that war, because it was a war of high significance, if you think about the scale of it. So it is said that more small weapons, by that I mean rifles, grenades, and all of these small arms, were used in that civil war than the Second World War combined. This is a Second World War where you had like a group of nations, like industrial nations, like, powers like the US, Germany and whatnot. And more small weapons were used in the Biafra war than that one. So that's the scale of destruction that you had there. So that's one motivation. But also, I found out while visiting Nigeria a few years ago in 2018, while researching An Orchestra of Minorities, my second novel, which came out last year. And there was this man who I've known for like a decade or more. He's been a family friend. He was our family tailor for a long time. And he always, he has this wound, like it deformed. His right hand was somewhat deformed. It was carved in a particular way. And I was just talking with him about growing up in back in the village in the 50s. And what was it like? Was he involved with the traditional religion of that place? And while talking, I was just out of, I just asked him, what happened to your hand, if you don't mind me asking? Was it a wound from your childhood? And he said, oh, no, this was a bullet wound from fighting in the Civil War. And I was like, my goodness, you fought in the Civil War? He said, yes, that he did. And, I started talking with him over a number of days. And at some point, the man was like, do you know that you are the first person to whom I've shared this story in 50 years or thereabout? I mean, no, not 50 years, 1972. Now, actually, yes, 50 years, So the war ended in 1970. And he fought basically throughout. He fought for 2 years and a half. He fought in some of the most, the hottest parts of the war, and he never shared this with anybody. Nobody even asked him. My dad did not even know. My dad was shocked. His friend of how many years was a war veteran, and he didn't know. So from then, I asked my dad, I said, okay, now you have to interview all the friends you've ever had. And he would discover that 2 other people, one of his bosses also was a veteran, and he never knew all these years, So that's, obviously they saw things that they just didn't feel was important or to share, or they just felt like they didn't want to scare people, or, they didn't want to tell stories that would disturb the minds of the civilians. I don't know. I really don't know, because I asked him, why did you never talk about this? And he doesn't have an answer. It was just a kind of bestiality and human brutality at a scale that it's very difficult for me as they say, millennial, someone who is a person of the modern age, to even think about what these guys were thinking when they were doing all this. Obviously the Biafrans, all of them whom I've found, with the exception of none, believed they were fighting a war of survival. They had no choice. So this was how they saw it. And on the Nigerian side, they were fighting a war of national unity. They wanted to make sure that Nigeria was one. So, both sides have a kind of rational reason for the war. But it's just, so it's been difficult. But, I feel like it's a story that needs to be told. And the novel, I think, I really cannot wait to finish it.
Maya Milatovic-Ovadia is another inspiring artist whom I spoke to as part of the research for this podcast. Originally from former Yugoslavia, Maya has directed over 30 productions for theatres across Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Slovenia, and is based in London. Every summer, with the exception of this year's Lost Summer, she travels to Bosnia, a place still scarred by the Yugoslav war in the 90s, to develop a theatre show with young people.
Through my work in Bosnia, where I'm not from Bosnia, but for the last 10 years I work in Prijedor area with young people, with second generation that grew up with the war. And actually the war is such a strong part of their everyday life, not only through collective memory, through history narratives which are now opposed, but also because Bosnia has very peculiar now political system, because it's international protectorate, but it's not. So it's complex.
How do you see it in the work that you're doing today? How do you see that the kind of the legacy of the war continuing to play out in the arts?
So, for example, in Bosnia, when you go there, especially when you go into in area where I work, it's Prijedor municipality, so it's part of Republika Srpska, and it's part also where there were concentration camps and when mass killings happened, like Omarska and Trnopolje and Keratin, all those concentration camps were formed there. So today, the kids or young people who grew up, they go to, especially in rural areas, in ethnically segregated schools, because the village is ethnically segregated, and they are taught completely different histories through education. Also, the family stories are usually one-sided narratives, and then there is this whole issue on a political level, on state level, where the state doesn't want to recognize crimes happening, the crimes that happened. They do not want to allow memorializations, and at the moment there is this movement called Dan Belih Traka, which is a white ribbon, day of a white ribbon, where with that movement, what is important is that all ethnicities are supporting it. It's an initiative for a monument memorial to be erected for 120 killed kids in the last war, but officials are not allowing them because then difficult questions will be raised. This past is still present because reconciliation never happened properly, and this kind of narratives, those contrasting narratives never met, so they coexist together, but there is no agreement. So you have people who completely deny what happened, and then people saying, no, but it did happen. So the kids who are growing up there, they are facing really bleak economic picture. They are facing this segregation, which is normal, that became normality to have ethnically segregated life. And they are facing art, which depends from which side it's coming. It's again, films or books or even history. It's very, you can pick up one-sided point of view. So what I'm doing there, I come and I was like, okay, let's play. And we start with one word, and then we devise a whole theater piece around that one word. And then they have opportunity first to tell their own stories or their own views. So I'm not coming with already written text, so I'm not imposing someone else's opinion about stuff. So we start from word, and then we devise and we tell all these kind of stories that these young people want to tell. And that's the place where they meet, because they are from segregated communities. So first they meet and they start developing their own narratives and understanding of narratives that they came with. This collective memory is questioned because they start just having fun and actually building meaningful relationships. But then also when the play is performed, we perform the play in Prijedor Theater for the wider audience, and then we tour it to Banja Luka and Mostar or small communities. What then happens is that they communicate that with the wider audience, which is also their parents, their families who are on opposing sides. They sit together in a theater, they listen this kind of different kind of story that their kids want to. I'm saying kids, they are all between 16 and 21 year old, so they are really young people. So that's what the projects are about. And then all these kind of historical memories came up.
Finally, I chatted to the poet and writer Stephen Watts about his friend W.G. Sebald. The late Sebald is a highly acclaimed writer, known particularly for his novels The Emigrants, Rings of Saturn and Austerlitz. Sebald's novels are steeped in memory. Many of his characters are people haunted by horrific experiences of the past.
Max Sebald, W.G. Sebald, was born in 1944 in the very south of Germany, very close to the Austrian border, close to the Swiss border also. And I think he always felt a bit of an outsider, and on the border person, a crossing borders person. The fact that he was born in 1944 seems to me to be really essential to understand all of his later life, and particularly his writing life, because it meant that he was born during that war period, during that period also of the Holocaust, but he was not old enough to have understood anything or to have known anything of that. There was big conflict, I think, with his father, who had been a soldier and whose activities and role during the Second World War are quite unclear, murky, unspoken. I think all of that led to Sebald choosing quite strongly to leave Germany by the early or mid-60s, and eventually he came to Manchester to follow postgraduate work in German and European studies at Manchester University, and subsequently went to University of East Anglia in Norwich. As a writer of non-academic work, although he was always writing poetry, although he was probably planning and maybe even wrote some manuscript novels or a novel in the 70s, he really didn't start considering himself as a writer until after some very difficult experiences in the early 80s. And his first published work, which was a long narrative poem, Nacht und Natur, was, I think, published in 1988 in German. And considering that he died in 2001, which was only 13 years later, he managed to write an astonishing amount in those last, let's say, 15 years of his life. We physically met in 1990 when I went up to UEA, to the British Centre for Literary Translation, which, of course, he had set up. That was one of his great initiatives, to set that up with Arts Council England funding. Max also liked outsiders. He appreciated outsiders, and I think he perceived in me an outsider in the world of writers and the world of poetry. And we also had a love of translation, a love of the sense that literature was beyond your own language. Certainly I've always felt that however much wonderful writing there is in English, there must be very, very much more wonderful writing in all the other languages of the world. And I've always stretched out to hear and embrace those other literatures. And I think that's why Max set up the British Centre for Literary Translation, because he had a sort of similar feeling. And certainly I also felt close to his sense of memory and history and language and landscape, all of which were very important to my writing before I met Max, and all of which were clearly essential to Max's writing.
I've been entirely immersed in conversations with these extraordinary artists about their practice, all exploring memory, family stories, trauma and silences. Along the way, I was introduced to the work of Dr. Marianne Hirsch, who's the William Peterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality. Marianne and I spoke on Election Day in America. She was quite delighted to have some distraction from the political news cycle. Marianne's developed a term, post-memory. She explained the expression and where it came from.
It happened sometime in the 1980s, and I would say it was both a personal insight coming out of my own personal experience as a daughter of survivors of the Holocaust, whose parents talked a lot about their experiences during the war. And it was an experience, a cultural experience, more broadly, cultural generational experience, because of a conjunction of books and films that came out in the mid-1980s that somehow brought me back to my own personal experience and allowed me to see it in a very different way. So as I said, my parents talked about the war all the time. The word survivor was not yet available in the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, but it was a constant presence in my life. And there came a moment in the mid-1980s when I realized that somehow I had more access to the stories and the spaces and the images that they were evoking in their narratives than to memories in my own childhood. I grew up in Romania. As a child, I left there when I was 12. So my own childhood was quite distant when I eventually came to the United States. And I seem to have fewer memories or less vivid memories of my own childhood than of the scenes that they evoked throughout my childhood and youth of the city where they grew up and where they survived the war and from which they eventually fled the Soviet Union. So in the 1980s, I first read Art Spiegelman's book Mouse, his graphic memoir of his father's survival and parents' survival in the Holocaust. Claude Lanzmann's Shoah came out right around the very same time, and it's a film that, even though I had avoided all images of Holocaust violence, as much as I could, when I knew what it was about, I would never go and see it because it was just too painful and too powerful. I went to see Lanzmann's film. I sat at right by the door so I could flee. But Lanzmann's film, it was very different because it was mainly voices of survivors who discussed their experiences, and it wasn't graphic imagery. I mean, there's no archival imagery in that film. And I was kind of driven by his experience. He's not second generation, but he was a very young, he was a child, adolescent during the war. And it was his curiosity that was driving the 9.5-hour film, and somehow I identified with that. I identified with Art Spiegelman's relationship to his parents' story and the medium that he had found to figure that story as a graphic memoir and as an animal fable. And then the third book that was so important to me was Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, which is a multi-generational novel about enslavement in the United States. And it is about the shift in generations, about the mother who committed infanticide, and who gave birth to a child just at the moment of fleeing across the river into freedom. And so it's that daughter was the one I identified with, who wanted to know more about the experience of slavery and the plantation, really needed to know, but didn't know because she didn't herself live through it, but she lived through the after effects of it. So I felt like these were, in some sense, memories, even though memories of experiences that in this subsequent second generation, we had not ourselves lived through. So can you have memories of experiences that you have not yourself had? And I concluded both from, sort of searching my own personal experience, talking to friends and colleagues and members of my generation, and reading and looking at artwork and so on, that these fragments, because they are fragments really, have a great deal of power in evoking stories and scenes as though they were memories. So I felt like I needed a term for that. It couldn't be memory because I'm not actually recalling anything except conjuring, interpreting. These are fragments of experiences that were passed down to me. So and to these other characters. So I coined this idea of post-memory, but post not only in the temporal sense of after, right? But it's sort of like, that we have so many posts, the relationship of modern and postmodern. I mean, it's not exactly that it just comes temporally after, but it somehow marks the difference. It's subsequent these memory and post-memory are deeply interconnected in multiple ways.
Is it simply a coincidence that they're all artists? I asked Marianne what role she thinks art plays in revealing and contextualizing these memories.
I understood the after effects of violence into the next generation. Not just through my own experience, I understood them better when I looked to the work of artists who had found a means to figure what I was experiencing. So it really helped me see what was happening to me. I think probably if I'd been in psychotherapy for that, it might have clarified a lot of things as well. And I'm not saying that art is therapeutic, but it is a way of sharpening some of these experiences and questions and finding a register, a language through which to figure them in their complexity. So what appealed to me, for example, about Mouse and the graphic memoir is precisely the squares, the squares and the breaks between them, the gutters between the squares. That, to me, through that, I understood the things that were not there, the forgotten parts, the way that memory can be broken into fragments and can be absolutely sharp with frames around some certain scenes, but then the scenes are not necessarily related in any kind of linear framework. There is something really important about the artistic process or going to art as a way of coping with these intergenerational legacies, because they take you out of yourself and your own family. And what, my idea of post-memory has evolved because I was very much focused on the family as a site of transmission. And I realized after writing sort of my first couple of articles about this or chapters that the family is intricately part of a larger social fabric. The family is not isolated from public images, public stories, public ideas. And so these experiences are shared. Of course, the way that parents communicate the past to their children is in the domestic. Art Spiegelman, in his very first Mouse, has the little boy mouse sit on his father's lap. And it's this transmission as a child that you get sort of from parent to child, almost like a bedtime story of the past. And, it's a figure for the way it suffuses the domestic life of the family. But it's not separate from the public images. There are many, many venues of this form of transmission in which the private and the public intersect. And art is really at that juncture of the very intimate and the public.
Mark had mentioned that Ganef was inspired by a story his mum had told him of her mother. I returned to Mark to ask him more about this.
Have you watched it with your mum? And I'm sure she's watched it many times. How does she respond to it when she sees herself or not herself in it?
I think she finds it quite moving and she feels it's quite powerful. I mean, for some reason, the name of... Look, first of all, it isn't exactly biographical. It's sort of drawn from those stories, and it certainly isn't like a sort of documentary drama. It's not a restaging of something that happened, but she, like her mum, weirdly the character of the mother, who is my mum's mum, would the equivalent of my mum's mum, carries her maiden name, so that probably makes her, I don't know why, but I just used it when I was writing and I never took it out, I never changed it, so I think that probably just it can't not but connect for her. But yeah, I think she finds it quite powerful and quite resonant, and it resonates quite strongly for her. Yeah, it must be quite weird to tell your son a story and then he turns it into a film, and that film is sort of a version of sort of a kind of fictionalized version by some degrees of difference, but sort of recognizably the world you came from. It must be quite an odd thing. I mean, it must be just kind of odd to have like artists as children, who then sort of you've told them stuff and then they sort of remake it and and then you have to watch it. I don't know what that would be like. It must be sort of strangely intimate, actually, and kind of. But I think the fact that she hasn't, I think she's wants people to see it, and I think that says as much as many words would.
Chigozie explained that his dad's friends were also keen to pass on their stories.
They are enthusiastic to share now because they trust me. I mean, they know that the story will get out there. I'm a writer, you see. But the process itself is not very easy for them. That's the sense I get. But I think they're happy to talk about it now. In fact, the Taylor guy, Lieutenant Nwafo, he wanted to talk about it all the time now. You know, he would. He would call me up. I'd be like, do you want more? It was like, it was as if he's been relieved of this great burden that he's carried with him for a long time. And he's very, if I call him down and say, okay, I want to ask you a question. How were you feeding? You know, and he knows that I want to ask him a question that would take like 5 minutes to answer. He would give me 20 minutes because it's as if he wants to, you know, like just get everything out. I mean, he's old, obviously. I'm sure he's thinking, he has anxiety around the fact that these stories might just die with him. So there's also that, geriatric anxiety that is pushing, is driving the stories.
Listening to Mark, Marianne and Chigozie, I was reminded of many conversations that I'd had when Dash was working in the former Soviet Union. Artists regularly talked of family secrets and silences that couldn't be broken. I spoke to the Russian actress and film star Oksana Misina, who is now based in Greece as she's been increasingly found working in Moscow to be too politically difficult for her.
Can I ask you this idea that you just said to me about secrets? The secrets that are in your family that that people don't talk about, but you want to explore them, and that's why you became an actor. Do you think that is something specific to growing up in the Soviet Union? Where you just didn't tell secrets?
Absolutely, yes, because it was not sometimes, but it was very dangerous. To open some secrets of the history of the families, because during Soviet period, people who had noble relatives, some of them were killed, some of them were prisons, and even in the 60s, when my parents were young, but we were born at this period of time. I was born in the 60s. Their colleagues were picked off from the institutes when somebody discovered their roots, the nobility. And so our fathers and mothers, they were whispering about some things, or they were so afraid that they decided not to tell anybody. I know that the brother of my grandmother, by the way, my grandmother, the mother of my mother, she was from the nobility, Mironov's family. And her brother was killed in Stalin's prisons. And she only told us his name. His name was George. And that's the only thing that we know about him. He disappeared.
It was fascinating to hear, or to try to hear, apologies for the poor connection, Oksana talking about the generations of silences and pain. Maya also spoke so powerfully about this in the context of the former Yugoslavia.
My husband, he's from Sarajevo, so we have a lot of this kind of conversations, how the war in Yugoslavia happened, because we didn't know nationalists and, we grew up with Yugoslav identity and all that. But actually, it did happen because some trauma from the Second World War were not addressed. And those traumas were boiling underneath the surface. So whatever, if you were coming from not partisan narrative, then you had some traumas. And the Second World War in Yugoslavia, you had kind of three wars in one. You had anti-fascistic struggle, you have social revolution, and then you had a bit of civil wars all over the place where neighbors were killing neighbors and or denunciating neighbors or stuff like that. And only when I started working in rural Bosnia, I realized that those narratives are very strong and that those villages were segregated even before. So, and there was this kind of family narrative that, so in a way you have three layers. You have official narrative, then you have complexities of historical narratives, and then you have this family narrative. That no matter what those two are, this one is boiling. So I think that if we manage just to question or to offer opportunity through art to that some narratives are not so singular, but also that truth is not so one-sided, that there is always complexity. For me, that's what art should do.
You know, this sense of these collective, this hidden, this unspoken traumas. Do you feel like you've released some of those in your own family through this process of working with the young people every year on, with their own, exploring it themselves? I mean, like, has that unlocked stuff for you that you didn't realize that was there through in that journey?
Yeah, I think so, because there is in my personal family we have few silences, but those silences I can't because most of my family is dead, so I can't ask questions, but I know that some questions like my aunt grandma, for example, she was in Auschwitz and she never talked about that. So there was this silence. We knew that, and then that was it. So there was no. She was also, but what stayed with me is that she was a woman. She died in 1994, but for her, she was one of the people who was so full of life. She was a journalist after the war, and she was always, all the time, somewhere. And she never talked about her trauma, but in my head, I was like, okay, the trauma actually opened up this unconditional love for life. In her case. So that stayed as one trauma. Then the Second World War trauma, I'm from partisan family. So my both grandparents, grandfathers, as well as grandmothers, one grandmother, they participated in war as partisans. And with my the grandfather who also died 92, I managed to talk, and he was he's my Slovenian grandfather, and he was quite open with this, because I was always intrigued for what you would go and risk your life. Is that, what kind of idea would trigger this, that you will be willing to go and risk your life? So we talked a lot about that. There is always doubt, because you always doubt, is too much questioning helpful or not? Because sometimes too much questioning easily leads to denial, which is not great. But also, what do you do with that? That's something that that I have personally a question, like, you open up questions, but what do we do with that? If we are just opening traumas and wounds for sake of it, then is that ethical? We need to open conversation only if we have an idea what to do with those answers and what to do with that trauma that will come out, and how we can create hope or better society or something. But just to open up trauma and leave people like, life is tough, is something that personally I found problematic.
I think you're right. I mean, what I'm hearing from the way that you've talked about it is that it's opened up confronting these things in your family over long, quiet gentler periods of time has opened you up as an artist, and is, you know, it is very much part of your practice now to you know, you're carrying that on through your work. I feel that from listening to you, and that's an extraordinary positive and amazing thing. For the young people that you're working with, is there a ongoing program of support? I mean, are there other things that happen when you're not there working with them in the summer?
You have young people who just want to get more active within their communities, so you help them with anything that you can, information or application or just being there, because we are all in contact on through Facebook anyway. So, but there is no in place systems. First, because the charity that I worked with was very small, and that's not possible. But bottom line, it's on a human level. So, but also what is very valuable is that group created support for themselves, because now those young people, from 6 years ago or 10 years ago, they support each other. There is no support for people who survived war traumas. There is no, it's not rich country, and also it's not a country who has means to support people with trauma.
And so do you think, you started off by saying there's a great denial on a very national level. I mean, you know, ultimately, without the resources and the ability to support the therapy and the conversation, somehow perhaps it's better to be in denial, you know, because once you start unlocking the Pandora's box, then you need to provide the support systems that enable people to talk about it and open up and have that help. And it doesn't sound like that exists.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's absolutely. That's why with this ethical question comes, what do you do? So why are you opening the trauma, and what are you going to do with that trauma? Because just to open it for the sake of opening it and leaving it there, it's not healthy. So
yeah, but of course I think it's extremely interesting to hear you talking about now, Maya, about how there was all this unspoken stuff left over from the Second World War, because of course that was never dealt with, that was never discussed, and this is the same thing again, you know, like this is just another layer of unspoken stuff that will just continue to feed until we have the next disaster.
They're completely quiet about things, then the trauma will, you know, boil from inside, and it will, you will pass on fear, distrust towards other and whoever other is. And that's coming back to these narratives, is where Yugoslav war, where this fall of Yugoslavia happened, because narratives from the Second World War, when they had chance to be addressed, probably not in 1945, but for sure in 1960s, when there was a chance for this trauma and complexity of the Second World War to be addressed within Yugoslav society, didn't happen. That's why we could easily have this war in the 90s. If those things, you know, were open up, then it wouldn't be so easy to spark again a fear, because the fear is something that, you know, and the revenges from personal family stories, because who killed your grandfather and stuff like that.
Back to Mark and Ganeth.
There's an idea that the Holocaust, the way that the Holocaust is represented in culture, is often that it ends at the end of the Second World War, or at the point of liberation. I mean, I rarely watch films. I've rarely seen films that represent the aftermath of the war. Or, you know, this film is set in 1962, and I just I thought that was an interesting place to go, because I hadn't seen that kind of experience represented very much. What happened when you tried to rebuild your life, having gone through what you went through, and set up again in a new city, speaking a new language in a new country, and you were confronted with suddenly living with all those you know, in an ordinary world, and you were carrying all that sadness with you and all that pain, what did you do with it? And in the 60s, I'm just going off on one really here, but in the 60s, you know, there wasn't therapy, and Jewish couples didn't talk to each other about, even a married couple who had both, say, been to Auschwitz, lived and has survived Auschwitz, probably wouldn't talk to each other about their experiences because it was seen as shameful, and it hadn't yet been it hadn't been validated by society. You know, Schindler's List wasn't going to arrive in the cinemas for many, many more years. And society as a whole hadn't properly said, yes, this happened to you. Yes, it really happened. And yes, the feelings that you have are valid. And yes, you must talk about them. It just hadn't happened yet. So I was just interested in a point in time where the trauma's there, but the outlet for it isn't. And what happens when the lid is on it so heavily that the main character, the woman, the mother in the film, is all we really discover of her is that she sleeps in the afternoon, and she's probably medicates, and she doesn't like noise in the house, and she has an Auschwitz tattoo on her arm, and we obviously hopefully were able to put together a picture of her state of mind. But yeah, I find it really interesting that I think that there's an impulse to like represent parts of the recovery process that I haven't really seen, and actually are quite hard to dramatize because there's no outlet for them. They're just people living with this baggage, not really knowing what or wanting to do anything with it.
I return to Silvina, who's been living and making work with her Armenian family's memories for more than 30 years.
It's a very rich content for you to explore. You know, extraordinary, your families, these amazing stories, this world that you can recreate that doesn't exist anymore. I can see why it's very exciting artistically. Do you feel some sense of responsibility to do it as well?
Yes, I think yes. Yes. Not everybody feels responsibility, but me personally, yes, I grew up with this grandmother, as I said, and there is this message, but also I think in the education, in the school, that don't let that we are forgotten, that our pain is forgotten, that our life, our existence. So that this is quite strong, yes. And I don't say, I feel it, and it's like this. It's not, let's say, a very positive feeling. It's heavy, but yeah.
Are there things that you feel still in your family or still in you that have some connection to that time in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of karma, but I think it can be transformed. But I am connected also through the pain of loss with them, that I would like to change that. For example, when it comes to my son, I tried for sure not to have, those discourse of don't forget. I would love to change that. What I, as third generation, give to my fourth generation son. Till now it worked very well. I have to say now is a very special moment because after so many years of, let's say, building bridges and reconciliation processes that took part on an individual level on my person, and also I tried to bring this new, let's say, path of communication, of coming together to other persons and other artists and whatever. The war that is taking place now against Nagorno-Karabakh, where, I mean, if you ask me, I don't have anything to do with Azerbaijan, but I have something to do with Turkey. And Turkey is actively, after not being able to recognize the wrong what their ancestors did, again attacking this small country called Armenia. And this is something like, wow, it's really hard for me. So
it's stirring up. Is it stirring up a lot of memories for you?
Yes. It's like I observe how old wounds are that I thought they are gone, are already coming up, and yeah, and I see how my son is observing everything, and I hope that it's not influencing very much his point of view, but it's hard moment. It's really a hard moment.
Silvina spoke about the current crisis in the Caucasus with real consideration and thoughtfulness. She made a film last month exploring her response. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Marianne and I chatted about these cycles of trauma and how it might be possible to break them.
I think that the most powerful thing that happened to me in Rwanda was actually a young man who had survived the genocide by being alive in a mass of corpses. He just was hiding. He had been shot and or injured. And, he was part of this workshop. He was a little older than some of the other participants. And he and I then had a really interesting correspondence, because he really wanted to know about post-memory, because what he really wanted to know is what was he handing down to his children, and how was his trauma going to affect his children and their children. So, right, this is exactly how I responded. I mean, just made me cry, because this is, the survivors and even the second generation are a hinge generation that is still affecting. And, Spiegelman drew a one-page comic about his son, and he, at the end, or his children, and at the end of it, the last frame says, they are grandchildren of Auschwitz survivors. So it's like, that's who you always are, But then can we break? I mean, the important thing to remember now is, because we're in such an interconnected world, how can we break out of the cycles of violence? And I think that's another real importance of this work. It's not just to relive the trauma, or to get our audiences, if we're artists, to relive the trauma and to feel it in this embodied way, but to interrupt the cycles of violence that we keep experiencing. And I think a lot of this artistic work is a search for that.
My interest in sort of in inherited trauma, I was talking about it before, I get angry whenever I see, I think the way the news cycles deal with violence in the world and report on it is very distorting, because it neatly boxes away, you'll see it, you'll hear a report about an airstrike in Gaza, or in Iraq or whatever, and we're so immune to these stories almost. What we never really talk about is the legacy of each and every moment of each and every one of those stories is going to trigger generations of changed behavior in those families that suffered in those moments, and the complexities and confusions of it. And that's what troubles me, and that's partly where Gunif comes from.
there are other histories that could be told that they are not just the traumatic histories. They're the histories of courage. They're the histories of the will to survive. They're histories of pleasure and joy at moments of extremity. They're histories of community and of rescue. So, I mean, I think retrieving some of those histories is very important as well. And I think that is, Ariella Azoulay, the scholar Ariella Azoulay, writes about potential history. And I think there are all these potential moments where things might have gone a different way. I think we need to retrieve that. We need to retrieve moments of resistance, stories of resistance, not heroic resistance like the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto necessarily, but small moments of community and of resistance. So I think those things are the things that are going to get us through some of the difficulties of this particular moment. So on the one hand, I think we owe something to the survivors to listen to their stories, to tell their stories, to embed them in a larger context. And I think that's a form of repair. You can't restore the before, but you can maybe repair the injuries, at least through these gestures. But it's more than that. It's also retrieving some of these responses that could serve as inspiration.
Stephen read me something that Sebald wrote in an essay in 1982, where memory and melancholy are an act of resistance. I asked him what he thought Sebald meant by that.
Sebald was saying that melancholy and memory are forms of resistance, and not just the resistance of the individual psyche, not just what the individual needs, but the resistance in a political sense. He says here, in the description of the disaster lies the possibility of overcoming it. I don't think there's a sense of being able to make it not happen again, because I think he was sanguine enough to know that that's not necessarily possible. But what he is saying is that only by understanding, only in a way, also by understanding, in a way, by removing the self from experience, by letting the experience speak for itself, and thus for ourselves, via memory often, are we able to come to terms with it.
I was wondering whether the Translation Centre might have been part of his resistance. Do you think? I mean, just thinking about whether because it's an extraordinary act of generosity and commitment to build something, but it also feels quite defiant in a way. I mean, is there something in that kind of creation of something that would help people understand? You know, that would break down some barriers of understanding, that was somehow connected to what he was trying to do through his own work and his own writing? Yeah, I think that's a very good point, very perceptive, of what things mattered to him in his life. And yeah, I think it wasn't an act of resistance. It was an act of resistance, I think, maybe to three things. One, to the changing atmosphere in academic life, which, as I said, when he started out in the mid-60s and went to UEA, there was an immense and wonderful freedom that a number of young academics have mentioned was present at the time, feeling that things could really be taught, and things could be taught freely and without bureaucratic restriction. So I think his attempt to set up BCLT was in one way an act of resistance to the strangling of academic freedom that he perceived as happening. I think it was also an act of resistance to the fact that British readers and British publishers really, particularly, until fairly recently, were pretty reticent about accepting translated literature. So here was Max Sebald as a German writer and academic working in an English university, saying he wanted to set up a British Centre for Literary Translation to enhance and celebrate and enable more translations to be published in the UK. And I think it was a third way of resisting, in the same way that his writing was a resistance against obliteration, a resistance against lost memory, damaged human beings. I think it was a very
positive and affirming action. And I think it was an action, a definite action, to set up the BCLT at that time.
Dr. Sarah Lack is a clinical psychologist who specialises in working with adults who've experienced trauma. She explained in general terms the response of fight or flight she finds in her patients. I told Sarah about Sebald and my conversation with Stephen. A lot of his work, in some ways, was dealing with his relationship with his dad and his relationship with the history and the legacy of growing up in Germany, born in the war, dealing with the after effects of the war and the history and the kind of burden. And Stephen read something that he wrote when he talked about like memory and melancholy being a resistance. And we were talking about what he meant, and like using the memory to resist, I suppose, to change. And what was just really interesting hearing you talk about the fight and flight aspect, because it made me think about a lot of the artists that I've been talking to over the last few weeks, and how in some ways what their practice is a form of resistance. I mean, resistance to the memory, and perhaps not wanting to continue the cycles of what has gone before them. So change, I suppose, enabling change. So I was just reflecting in the conversation to Stephen that Sebald, one of the things he did was form this amazing, like the first ever centre of translation and poetry and literature and translation in the UK, in UEA. It was radical and exciting, and I was suggesting that might have been some part of his resistance, this idea of like breaking down borders, language borders, in being a really essential part of understanding and empathy, and in some ways that was part of his own resistance to his memories. And it kind of transitions us a little bit into talking a bit more about the role of art in all of this. Like, I'm not sure that any of it's conscious, but it is a form of dealing with the trauma. And I think a lot of the artists that I'm working with that's their way of exploring some of these ideas.
It's like doing therapy, isn't it? Because you're not avoiding the memories, you're not suppressing them, you're not trying to pretend that they never happened and carry on regardless. You're delving into them, you're going there, you're facing the horror or the sadness or the loss or whatever it was, and turning it into something potentially beautiful, or at least meaningful to you and your community or your family. So again, that's that idea of healing, which I think must be, I mean, I'm not an artist, but it must be a driver behind why people do those kinds of art pieces.
For Maya, her preferred form of resistance is comedy.
You think comedy can unlock something that this work can't do?
Yeah, absolutely. That's not scientifically, but I'm absolutely sure from my experience, because that's when with the first project, when we sent it up a call for participants, because this is free call, I don't work with institutions, so you have to be there. It's whoever wants to come. And then, and actually the people came. The comedy thing was one of the triggers, or one of the invites for young people to apply, but also for audience to come. We have really full theater when people are sitting on the stairs, and that's very unusual for professional theater shows in Prijedor. So that's something that is very beneficial, that you bring people in, that you get permissions from the officials, because art and comedy art, it's not political. And also it's beneficial because having fun while you are dissecting society is something that's valuable for relationships, and also for this kind of happy ending hope that I think we need to bring. Otherwise, what's the point?
And returning to Chigozie.
I'm interested in the role that art generally, and obviously in your case particularly fiction writing, can play in sharing these stories, in unlocking some of the silence and potentially redressing some of the bad. Do you think that the art can do it, and perhaps in a way that the history books can't, or that non-fiction can't?
Yes, I think so. Fiction endures more. Like we are still reading what's it called now? Lord of the Flies, or we're reading All Quiet on the Western Front, these many years later, 70 years or so, or even more than that, then many of the memoirs of even someone like General Patton, I mean, there's a select few who read those memoirs, but it's not as popular as the novel. So I feel like the novel is for me the most advanced and complex art form that there is. And so in that way, because of its potential or its capability, so to speak, to reach a wider audience and to endure, I think it can do that kind of intervention. It can create an awareness, at least, of what has happened in the past, and it can, in fact, even call for healing. Because one of the things that these veterans were sad about, which all of them pointed out to me, was that they were neglected in the aftermath of the war. So with all they did, the tailor guy could not go back to school. He went into the war at 18, just when he was finishing high school. So there was this big disruption in his life that he had to just start doing small labor to be able to fend for his family and what was left of them. So they want some kind of at least acknowledgement, if not a tribute of some kind. I think there's a wound that they feel. They have not resentment. I don't think it's resentment, but they feel like their struggle has not received and sacrifice the kind of attention and at least acknowledgement that on a national level that it deserves.
And what you're doing in the novel is that you're making that particular experience a universal one. So it gets wider recognition.
That's right. And, I will dedicate it to the three of them and also others whom I didn't speak with. Yes.
I return to Mark to play him an early version of this podcast and hear his thoughts.
More than anything, just affirms the reasons that I make Gunneth are universal, that it isn't the kinds of experiences I'm trying to articulate in Gunneth don't belong exclusively to the Holocaust. They belong to any group of people that have gone through that kind of persecution and then have not been able to exercise those demons in a constructive, healthy way. That if you put a lid on it, if you're not allowed to talk about it, if society doesn't validate it, then it rolls on. And lots of the other artists that you've interviewed and experts that you've interviewed, all of their experiences chime with that. So it was really, in some ways, it was really, I knew that, but I hadn't heard it. So it was really nice to hear that people have gone through that, but healthy to hear other people from completely different backgrounds and heritages discussing how they've had to wrangle with the past and with what their forebears have suffered. And actually, as a collective of voices, whilst my story, possibly my grandma wasn't able to get the kind of therapies or resolutions that perhaps would have been healthy for her in her lifetime. Interesting to hear how other people are, finding healthy outlets for what they've gone through. The one thing that no one said about art in relation to this, trauma is it's a chaotic feeling, and art then story is a way of organizing chaos. And so to be able to make something and look at it is an incredibly powerful attempt to contain chaotic feelings.
Control them.
Yeah. And look at them. Because the trauma, otherwise, what it does is it blurs boundaries. Your sense of yourself and of others is melded, because there's no division that's being created between you and, say, the people that did this to you. They haven't stood back and said, we did it and you're separate from us. It becomes psychologically blurred. And so it becomes important to be able to just step back and sort of contain and organize it.
I hope that our podcast has brought some order to the chaos. It's certainly been extraordinary for me to hear these artists acknowledge their wounds and reflect so inspiringly on their families' stories. I was left with a real sense of the power of art to enable healing. We'll put links to as much of the work featured by the artists in our podcast as we can, and would love to hear from you of other artists who've inspired and supported you. Please do get in touch with us through our website. Thank you to all my guests, to Mark, Silvina, Chigozi, Maya, Stephen, Oksana, Sarah and Marianne, and to writer and journalist Peter Jukes, whose conversation I couldn't squeeze into this podcast, but who explained that his mother's background as the daughter of someone fleeing the Armenian genocide has had a profound impact on everything he's ever done. The team behind the Dash Arts podcast is me, Josephine Burton, Christina Catalina and Natalie Beach. You can find more episodes wherever you get your podcast or by going to our podcast section on our website, dasharts.org.uk. If you like the Dash Arts podcast, follow the show, share, and do leave us a message and a review. It helps us stay visible and would mean the world to us. I'm Josephine Burton, back soon with more conversations at the Dash Arts podcast. Thank you for listening.
Ветров и красивой строкой